Harsha Wallia will be speaking about Vancouver's Olympics legacy, from homelessness to migrant labor exploitation. Harsha is an activist and writer involved in local and global anti-capitalist and anti-colonial movements, migrant justice organizing, and feminist and anti-racist networks. She works in the downtown East Side.
I think in terms of talking about specifically the impacts of the Olympics in Vancouver, there's a lot that's sort of self-evident, but I want to focus on three in particular. One is housing, the other is policing insecurity, and finally on migrant labor. In terms of housing specifically, leading up to the 2010 Olympics, people may remember the bid corporation, in conjunction with the IOC and VANOC, had made a bunch of sort of promises to give legitimacy to the slogan of a quote-unquote Olympics for all. And this is part and parcel of this, very vague idea that the Olympics can be socially sustainable, that go along the idea of the Green Olympics that Chris talked about, right? So in addition to this idea and this myth of the Green Olympics, there's this idea that the Olympics will benefit everyone. This is no coincidence. These promises were hollow, and they're simply to sloganeer in terms of what the Olympics may bring. According to a study by the Fair Play for Housing Rights, quote, "The desire to show off a city and make it an attractive tourist destination is often accompanied by a process of sanitization, cleanup of public areas facilitated by criminalization of those who are homeless." And again, this may seem like simple rhetoric, but this is coming from an international, relatively mainstream NGO who does research on the Olympic Games. So in terms of BC and Vancouver 2010, what do we see? Today in BC, the quote-unquote homelessness crisis is estimated at over 10,000 people. Most evident, of course, in Vancouver's downtown East Side. It's estimated that since 2003 to 2010, the number of homeless will have tripled in BC. So again, a stark contradiction between the so-called promise of no one being rendered homeless and, in fact, homelessness tripling. The most impacted by poverty and homelessness across this province on unceded territory are, of course, Indigenous peoples, women, particularly single mothers, people with disabilities, recent migrants. In terms of the downtown East Side specifically, because I'm focusing on Vancouver, what we've seen in Vancouver's downtown East Side since 2003 is approximately 1,200 low-income housing units have been lost. 1,200 in a neighborhood that's approximately a 4-block radius. At the same time, what do we have? So what's happened to these 1,200 low-income housing units? Many of them are being converted in this process of gentrification, real estate speculation, and leading up to 2010, there's going to be approximately 1,500 to 1,600 condo units being developed in the downtown East Side core. And this has been called in the past year, local downtown East Side residents call this the condo tsunami that's overtaking this neighborhood. In 2006, there was what was called a poverty hotel buying binge. And what we saw during this time period was at least 22 single-room occupancy hotels traded hands. So basically, real estate developers flipping property. And this represents approximately 1/3 of the housing stock in the downtown East Side. So certainly, as people have said, and this is self-evident, the real estate market, construction companies, and developers have a lot to gain from the real estate speculation and the market that comes from the Olympic Games. And the psychology of developing the downtown East Side is very reminiscent, including in their language, of colonization. This idea that the downtown East Side is uncharted territory waiting to be developed. Woodward's slogan, like living life on the edge, and developers who really believe that no one lives in the downtown East Side. But again, in addition to the corporate sector's profiteering during the Olympics and as a part of the real estate speculation, the government is of course complicit. Gentrification and real estate development cannot happen without the active complicity of the government. In terms of Vancouver, we see the city not enforcing its standard of maintenance bylaws, and what that is basically a bylaw that forces landlords to keep buildings up to code. So we have, this may seem sort of counterintuitive, but developers who will let their buildings crumble and allow them to become condemned to the point where they can then flip that property, allowing their buildings to become vacant, so slow conversions where buildings will empty out, they'll refuse to rent out to anyone else so that again they can flip these property. And there are bylaws that are supposed to protect renters against these sorts of things, but the city refuses to enforce their own bylaws. And I think when we talk about housing, the one thing that's really important to talk about is because there's this sort of idea that all we have to do is ask the government to build more housing. And all these studies come out that say, oh, it's cheaper to house people than it is to have people become homeless. But we have to understand that the government benefits from homelessness. I'm going to skip really quickly to policing and security because, of course, again, in terms of the state's complicity in ensuring this process of gentrification, policing is a big part of this because police are needed to control, as people have already said, this coercive process of gentrification. People are not going to not resist being thrown out onto the streets. People are not going to not resist being rendered homeless across BC, and ensuring the social control of these people who've been rendered disposable. So in the lead up to the 2010 Olympics, there was a series of initiatives to clean up the downtown east side in particular, because I'm focusing on in Vancouver. The $1 million project Civil City people may have heard about is partially funded through the Olympic Legacy Fund. It prohibits sitting or lying on city sidewalks. It increases surveillance and private security initiatives. Closed-circuit television cameras are used to deter public disorder, increases enforcement against aggressive panhandling, and has introduced dumpster-free alleys, which would make it impossible to access food, clothing, and recyclables for those who depend on these things. And one of the most ironic things about the Olympics, and Garth sort of mentioned this in terms of the broader picture, but one of the most ironic things of the Olympics is that everything that's perceived to be positive about the Olympics is a function of the Olympics, and everything that's negative about the Olympics, VANOC has nothing to do with it. So, but it's quite explicit. So for a long time, Mayor and City Council said Project Civil City has nothing to do with the Olympics, and they were trying to deny the fact that there was any relationship. However, quite recently, in an open letter to residents of Vancouver, Sam Sullivan has written, "There's no question that we must act swiftly and decisively to solve the public disorder that affects our city. I believe we have a tremendous opportunity to use the 2010 Olympic and Paralympic Games as a catalyst to do just that." So again, this idea that the Olympics is providing an opportunity for something that governments have always wanted to do in terms of opening up the downtown east side to real estate development and entirely gentrifying that neighborhood. The 2010 Olympic Games are boasting the largest security operation in Canadian history, with an ever-expanding budget that's currently estimated to be as high as $1 billion, and it could go higher. The RCMP has created the Special Vancouver 2010 Integrated Security Unit, and the Canadian Forces has established its Joint Task Force Games to plan for 2010 security. There'll be nearly 13,000 RCMP, military, and other security personnel here in Vancouver during 2010. There's a sociologist at Queen's University called David Lyon who's basically called the 2010 Games the surveillance games, and that's essentially what the games are about. And I think, as folks have mentioned, it's important to understand this is intrinsic to the games, particularly in a post-9/11 climate. In a post-9/11 climate, this state of fear has become normalized. We're led to believe it's an exceptional state of being, but it's a normalized state of being that we're sold. And it's being manipulated both by the state and, again, the private industry. The global market around security is booming, and not just in Vancouver, not just in Canada, everywhere across the world, from Israel to Canada to China. The security boom is huge, and it's a multi-billion-dollar industry post-9/11. Much of the security apparatus in Canada, or around the Vancouver 2010 Games, as Dustin mentioned, is part and parcel of the SPP, the Security and Prosperity Partnership Agreement. And what the SPP is basically a NAFTA plus Homeland Security model that strives to establish increased North American economic competitiveness and more advantageous conditions for multinational corporations. And to do that, they're ensuring a more rigorous domestic and international military and security regime. So that's how 2010 kind of plays into that. Part of the Olympic Games, which is part of the whole global phenomenon right now of how labor is functioning in this world, is migrant labor is central as a hyper-exploitable labor force that are being used in all sorts of development projects, the Olympics being one of them. It's important to remember, because there's sort of a really easy way to have a knee-jerk reaction that migrant workers are quote-unquote stealing our jobs. But most of the migrant workers around the world are people who are being forced off their own traditional territories because of this global system of capitalism that is forcing people to migrate across borders, within borders, and to seek these hyper-exploitable workforce and to become part of this hyper-exploitable workforce. And in Vancouver, for example, with the RAV line, we know that migrant workers who were brought in from Latin America and the Caribbean were being paid $6 to $8 an hour, and oftentimes weren't even seeing their paychecks and are currently in the process of being unionized, but every time they try to unionize, they're deported because that's their condition of expendability. And this is a critical connection in terms of the Olympics, in terms of corporate profiteering. Nothing is more desirable for a corporation than an exploitable workforce. So just to conclude, the negative consequences of the Olympics that we've all talked about and that I'm talking about here today, I want to stress that these are in fact intended. It's important to realize that the negative symptoms of homelessness and policing, these cannot be avoided with the Olympics. They're part and parcel of the Olympics industry that we've talked about here today. So we can't call for the Olympics Games to become more fair. We can't ask for them to be greener. We can't ask for the Olympics to pay for people who are becoming homeless. These are part of the Olympics industry, and it's not a failure of the Olympic Games. In fact, these are a massive success of the Olympic Games, because that's what the Olympic Games is all about. And you know, when we talk about, for those who are familiar with sort of this idea that Naomi Klein is branded around disaster capitalism, the Olympics are part of that. They're, you know, they're not necessarily disaster, but they're a form of celebration capitalism or celebratory capitalism, where our psyche is ingrained to think that we're in a zone of exception, which is, you know, as Garth said, actually quite normal. And it justifies land grabs, gentrification, displacement, exploitation, and the fortification of this massive national security apparatus. And I think just the last thing that I'll say is that some words from George Orwell, who said that serious sport is nothing more than war minus the shooting. Thank you.